Inside the White House, President Woodrow Wilson conferred with advisors and signed the proclamation of war.
And men, women, and children lie prostrate or writhing under the Hitler.
Although the communists have twice gained the advantage through sneak attacks, time and world opinion are on the side of the United States. Allied officials, tourists, or Western businessmen wishing to enter East Germany clear through here.
The Cold War days are over. By destroying camps and disrupting communications, we will make it more difficult for the terror network to train new recruits and coordinate their needs. Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land, and sea. Their mission, to remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
By the late 19th century, long-distance telecommunication was dependent on a massive intercontinental network of undersea telegraph cables. Known as the All Red Line, it connected Imperial Britain to its territories. In 1901, Guillermo Marconi sent a message by radio for the first time in history. 3 years later, the first wireless communication was intercepted by HMS Diana while stationed in the Suez Canal during the Russo-Japanese War. But in June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was the catalyst for one of the deadliest conflicts in history, and the driving force behind the evolution of GCHQ.
By the beginning of the First World War, we had in place all the various types of visual signalling, but the First World War was really the first proper use of electronic communications, and that included telegraphy, telephony, and wireless.
No military force had regularly been able to acquire communications intelligence on any army before 1914, or navy.
The great advantage that the British enjoy during the First World War and all the way through into the early 21st century is ownership of much of the world's communication cables.
In August 1914, a British ship cut the undersea telegraph cables connecting Germany to the rest of the world, forcing the Germans to use Britain's cables or wireless communications. This resulted in huge volumes of German wireless traffic, which the British Army and Navy lacked the resources to process, until Alfred Ewing, Director of Naval Education, assigned a group of civilian experts the task of decrypting German naval messages out of room 40 in the Admiralty Building on Whitehall. The Army set up their Signal Interception Section, MI1B, in the War Office. It was a stroke of luck that saw the British acquire the 3 main German naval codebooks by the end of 1914. One from the Russians, who recovered 3 copies of the standard codebook from the German light cruiser Magdeburg when it ran aground off the coast of Estonia. One used for communications with merchant ships was shared by Australian authorities. And the final codebook, for operations at sea, was found in a lead-lined box by a British trawler.
The Germans tried to raid the British coast to provoke the bear, so to speak. And the British began to realise once you got a certain set of messages, it meant that the German fleet was coming out. And there's a lot of conspiracy theories that they allowed bombardments to take place in order to create political support for conscription. But in fact, they didn't know which ports were going to be bombarded. So what they would do instead was allow the Germans to come out, bombard the ports, and then try to catch them on the way back.
Although the British are often able to launch a counter-ambush, where it matters that basically you prevent the Germans from being able to launch a successful ambush of you. It means also that you're able to use blockade.
Getting your forces up against the German coast and restricting the movement of their navy just simply isn't possible after the turn of the century, because you have underwater mines, these new U-boats, coastal artillery. So the British therefore used geography to their advantage. Instead of a close blockade, the Royal Navy is going to do a distant blockade. What you see in the final week of May 1916 is Room 40 decrypting German message traffic and starting to piece together a number of indicators that the Germans are up to something. The core problem for Room 40 and the Admiralty is the Germans know if they transmit, their messages will be picked up and the Royal Navy will be able to get locational information by triangulating the position of the signal. So once Jellicoe or any other naval commander has set sail, you can send them messages, and as long as it doesn't reveal the fact that you are decrypting the German message, that's fine. The problem is Jellicoe has to always err on the side of caution.
The German Navy's plan was to ambush and destroy the British fleet by luring them across a line of U-boats, drawing them south into the path of waiting battle cruisers. During the Battle of Jutland, 14 British and 11 German ships were destroyed, and nearly 10,000 men died, with both sides claiming victory. By 1916, unable to defeat the British Navy, the German fleet was effectively contained by the blockade. Germany planned to enact unrestricted U-boat warfare, but was concerned the tactic might draw America, so far neutral, into the war. A plan was devised to entrench the US in a war on its home soil. German State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a message to the German ambassador in Mexico, suggesting the Mexicans join with Germany against America. The telegram passed through a relay station in Porthcurno, Cornwall. It was sent to Room 40, who were able to decode and read it.
They're able relatively quickly to come up with the rough gist of what this message contains, which is essentially unrestricted U-boat warfare is going to resume and encourage Mexico to attack the United States. They take this to Admiral Hall, who decides not to disseminate this through the usual channels. If he tells the Foreign Office straight away, the Foreign Office might tell the Americans will then realise that the British are intercepting and decrypting their cables. So you have to deal with this very, very gently and very, very carefully. Using the Naval Intelligence Division's network over in America, essentially what he does is get hold of a copy of the relayed version from Washington to Mexico. So if you're ever then asked, how did you come by this? The cover story is that you managed to get hold of a physical copy of the cable. Hall engages with senior officials in the Foreign Office who realise actually this is potentially very, very important. By this stage, the Germans have started to enact unrestricted U-boat warfare, so the pressure is building on President Wilson to join the war. Wilson at this stage is very much hold the line on non-intervention. Hall then sort of unilaterally decides to take it to the American embassy. It's transmission to Washington. President Wilson is annoyed that the Germans are doing this behind his back at the same time as he is trying to broker peace. And the American government decides that their best route is to leak this to the press. Pressure continues to mount on Wilson. American ships are starting to be sunk. Wilson is finding it increasingly difficult to hold this non-interventionist line. The Zimmermann telegram makes it easier for the Americans to go to war.
Inside the White House, President Woodrow Wilson conferred with advisors, then signed the proclamation of war against Germany.
Mexico declined the invitation for an alliance, leaving Germany further exposed. A combination of convoys and direction finding undermined the effectiveness of their U-boat attacks. But while the Allies took control of the sea and the North Atlantic blockade held fast, on land, war raged on.
The big developments that occurred in the period immediately before the First World War is the advent of wireless, and the First World War accelerates the development.
The main use of wireless during the first couple of years of the war was by the fledgling flying corps to spot artillery fire. It was still difficult to tune, it wasn't terribly robust, they were only as good as the code that you used. And you had to carry around batteries which were literally a pain to carry due to the leaking battery acid. As a substitute, they tended to use line. You could speak to everybody securely. You could send Morse, which would be clearer and have a longer range down that physical structure. But your standard telephone lines were fragile things and kept getting broken through shell fire or people standing on them. The British Army used a system for their field telephones called a single cable and earth return. A single cable going between the two handsets, then they put an earth spike in the ground and use the conductivity of the earth to complete that circuit. The French and then later the Germans discovered a way of intercepting this by putting in their own ground spikes and then taking what was left of that very weak electric signal and then amplifying it through a number of valves so that they could overhear that signal.
And what is clear is that in 1916, the Germans and the French moved far ahead of the British. The British don't really understand the scale of the problem. And it seems pretty likely that on the first day of the Somme, well over half of the British attacks, the Germans actually know of in advance, quite literally to the minute and to the yard, because they've intercepted tactical telephone traffic.
By 1915, the British had adopted similar tactics. However, because both sides were constantly trying to steal codebooks or intercept and decipher each other's messages, encryption became an important part of frontline communications.
You are listening into the German conversations. They start to pick up indications that the Germans are about to launch a raid. They will immediately notify the troops. What you see is the encrypted traffic will be dealt with within the general headquarters in France. London, in the form of MI1B, acts as an overseer of this process. What actually it's happening within theatre.
Although cables were used extensively across the Western Front, wireless communication became a necessity in other theatres. Originally deployed for reconnaissance, airships were soon involved in bombing raids on Britain. Their combat effectiveness was limited, but they had a terrifying psychological effect.
The appearance of German Zeppelins, dropping bombs on Britain is a deeply shocking thing to happen. So there is a great deal of sort of political impetus to do something about this. The British are greatly assisted by the fact that a Zeppelin finds it very difficult to navigate, particularly if it's trying to do so at night. So how do they get around this? Well, actually what they start to do is to use wireless to help them to navigate. So essentially the Zeppelin communicates back asking, okay, I'm sending you this message, what bearing are you receiving this message on? That wireless station then sends the message back to the Zeppelin, says, I'm picking you up on this bearing, this station's picking you up on that bearing, and then the German Zeppelin is able to triangulate its position. Of course, the problem with that is that the British can listen in, and particularly once the British break into their encryption system, the British can not only pick up from direction finding where the Zeppelins are, but they can also pick up the chatter between the Zeppelins. They can pick up the chatter from the Zeppelins back to Germany. So very early on, they've got a very, very good picture of these incoming raids.
The real problem is actually getting aircraft up that can hit the Zaps. They're so high. But you're able to do that by 1917, and as soon as early 1917 happens, the Zeppelins essentially are out of the game.
Through the development of what we would call today an integrated air defence system, the Zeppelin threat is neutralised. 1917, the Germans then start to use fixed-wing bombers, and this is a much more complicated task to deal with. Initially, when the Germans are doing this in daylight, they're not needing to use direction finding to find out where they are. The problem, of course, if you're doing daylight raids is it's easier for the interceptors to find you, and therefore the Germans switch to night raids. Again, they start to use the radio direction finding, but also you start to find other indicators that the Germans are about to do a raid. So for example, the Germans would send up a reconnaissance aircraft ahead of a raid to fly across to Britain, which would then radio back the weather details, and that would then become an indicator that a raid is about to come.
The British create an amazingly fast-moving information processing system for air defense, which basically is copied by Fighter Command of the Second World War. During the war, the British intercept about 80 million cables, 20 million wireless messages. No intelligence agency has ever handled this volume of material before. But a very small signals intelligence assessment organization is able to process it and disseminate it in real time. And also automation is used for the first time in code breaking. There is probably a kind of data processing machine that is used to build the vocabulary of German codes used in Room 40. Although the details are scanty, it's pretty clear that's what we're dealing with. Now, this is the single most complex piece of data processing which has ever happened in history.
On the 11th of November, 1918, World War I ended. Room 40's contribution was not forgotten. Lord Curzon, whose background had been running the empire in India, was instrumental in a merger between naval and army intelligence.
Because intelligence was so central to the running of the empire, Curzon gets intelligence. But what he can see after the Zimmermann telegram is the importance of this new technical apparatus. And it's Curzon more than anyone else who insists that the government code and cipher school should be an all-service, integrated civilian and military organisation.
By 1919, Room 40 and MI1B had become the first British peacetime code-breaking agency. They were called the Government Code and Cipher School. Run by Alistair Denniston, they were tasked with advising the government on security, codes and ciphers. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed severe financial losses in the form of reparations on Germany. The country had lost much of its territory. There was a revolution in 1918 and a period of sustained social and political upheaval. And by 1933, a new chancellor, Adolf Hitler. When President Hindenburg died, Hitler declared himself not just chancellor, but president and head of the army. A revanchist Germany, rearming fast under fascist rule, threatened peace.
Germany is actually very low on the target list of British code breaking throughout the interwar years. They actually lose access to German systems in the early 1920s and don't try to recover it. The British, by the mid-1930s, in fact, getting essentially nothing on Germany.
The 1930s is a difficult period for the British codebreakers. The biggest problem is perhaps Chamberlain. Chamberlain is a bad intelligence customer, and unfortunately Chamberlain was inclined to only accept intelligence which reinforced his picture of Hitler, who was, yes, a nationalist politician, but someone who could be brought to the negotiating table.
Between the wars, many people were much more wary of the communists and the Soviets, thinking, oh, Hitler would come good, and us being less worried about right-wing nationalism than we were about the creep of communism. And in many respects, the culture, the German culture, was so revered. You know, the poets, the musicians, the boulevards. You know, Munich was a place to be. In the late 1930s, GC and CS managed to break into Japanese traffic, and they made an alarming discovery. Germany, Japan, and Italy were discussing an offensive alliance against Great Britain. War looked imminent. Preparations were stepped up. GC and CS had to be moved somewhere secret to avoid bombing raids. Admiral Sinclair acquired Bletchley Park in the spring of 1938, and a small group, under the cover story of a shooting party, moved into the park's mansion that September. But at a meeting of top European leaders in Munich that same month, Germany, France, Great Britain and Italy signed an agreement. This capitulated to Hitler's demands to annex the strategically important Czechoslovakia region of Sudetenland. War was off the cards. Captain Ridley's shooting party moved back to London. But in 1939, Germany reneged on the agreement, taking full control of Czechoslovakia. It was back to Bletchley for the codebreakers. After the First World War, the development and evolution of mechanical cryptographic machines had been widespread. The German military had adopted a commercially used machine with very specific needs in mind. It was called Enigma.
The first Enigma machines were essentially for business and commercial use. So this is why it was relatively widespread, and it's the introduction of a very high-grade, high-quality machine. If it's used properly, it's very difficult to break, and Germany is introducing this en masse.
What the Germans do with Enigma is create a system which allows you to service very fast-moving mobile forces. When the British look at it, they say, it's so insecure, we're going to go and build their own variant of Enigma, but it's linked to teletype systems initially, called Type X. One of the reasons we don't talk about Type X is that nobody ever broke it.
Alfred Dilly Knox had been a member of the original Room 40. He had continued to work at GC and CS, and as chief cryptographer had been tasked with cryptanalysis of the Enigma using a commercially available machine. However, Poland were ahead of the game. An independent country since the Treaty of Versailles in 1922, they were all too aware of the threat posed by Russia and Germany. The Polish Cipher Bureau in Warsaw had taken great interest in German Enigma messages. With war imminent, Polish mathematician Marian Rejewski shared his solution to breaking the codes generated by Enigma.
What you've got with Enigma is all these different wiring variations, and the first one is from the keyboard to the first set of flexible wiring changes. When Dilly Knox started looking at it, that was what he got stopped at. As it turned out, it was A to 1, B to 2, C to 3, but he never considered that possibility. He assumed that it must be more complex, and it was the Polish who brought that information and allowed then the first Enigma breaks to occur.
The climax of the Polish effort really is in 1939, where they developed the so-called bomba, which is this machine that can produce a clue to what setting is being used. But for each different combination of rotors being used by the Germans in Enigma, you need a different bomba. Initially they had 3 rotors. Unfortunately, the Germans then go to using 5 rotors, so overnight the Poles go from needing 6 machines to needing 60 machines. And building 60 bombers at that point was just beyond the capabilities of the team.
On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the north, the south and the west, and Russia from the east.
Hitler is thinking, well, the British haven't gone to war over Czechoslovakia, so they're not going to go to war over Poland. But of course, the British and the French have reached the end of their tether. And famously, Hitler turns to one of his assistants in the headquarters and says, what do we do now? And to some extent, that shows you that neither the British nor the Germans had particularly good signals intelligence on each other. The landscape of international relations was quite dark.
Poles during the 30s had concentrated on cracking into Enigma and were able to develop some tools that you could use to break into it. But the Poles are too poor to buy data processing machines. And so at a certain stage, when the Germans ratchet up security, the Poles can't break in. The Poles and the French had very loosely talked about these things in the 30s. And in 1939, the Poles, the French, and the British form a code-breaking alliance, a very close one. They share everything. They're integrated. And so when Poland falls, some of the Polish code-breakers get out. Some are imprisoned in German prisoner of war camps. Some are at Auschwitz. They never talk. This is very courageous. When the French fall, all of this stuff ends up in Britain's hands.
The Polish work on Enigma was now in British hands. Along with classical codebreakers from Room 40, an eclectic mixture of boffins and high society women began work on GC and CS's #1 research target, cracking Enigma. The day after war was declared, Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman reported to Bletchley.
What they're looking for are not normal mathematicians. Alan Turing, of course, is one of the most creative minds of the mid-20th century, but Gordon Welchman, who is brought in the same group of four, is as important as Turing is to making the process of breaking Enigma work. But the British are looking for people who are willing to deal with fuzziness. In a way, what they're looking for are computer scientists without understanding that.
I think that the polls demonstrating that it is possible to build a device that can do this work for you, and that you can build mechanical contraptions that will help you with this. I think Knox and Turing have that in their minds in late 39, early 40. They've been shown that it's possible, even though the machine works on a different specific mathematical principle. Just the sheer fact that it's doable at all has been demonstrated by the polls.
When Turing and then Welchman figure out how to do it, when they present this to the heads of GCNCS, immediately what these guys say is, we're going to go to the head of SIS and we're going to get money. The imitation game account of Turing is absolutely wrong. They love him, and they follow his advice whenever he gives it to them, and in this case they make a massive investment. And quite literally within a day, SIS provides £100,000 to build this machine. Now that's the single largest expenditure that I know of in the history of British intelligence. One of the world's best designers of data processing machines, Doc Keane, works for the British Tabulating Machine Company. This £100,000 goes to him, and he creates the bomb.
The first bomb machine was named Victory and installed at Bletchley Park in 1940.
When the Germans were using Enigma machines, each network had an agreement on what the settings would be on the machine for the messages they sent that day. To work out those settings, the people at Bletchley Park used all kinds of clever tricks. They knew, for example, the format of messages that had weather forecasts in them. From traffic analysis, they might know where a message was coming from and where it was going to.
They noticed that if the RAF laid sea mines in certain areas of the channel, the Germans would figure this out and they would report it in an Enigma message. So there's a process called gardening, where you go out to a particular grid square, you lay some mines, you wait for the Germans to report that fact, and then you have a perfect crib to that message because they're reporting on a location you already know.
And from that intelligence, they would build up a hypothesis as to what the key of the day might possibly be. They would create something called a menu, which was set up on the back of the bomb machine as a lot of wiring, and then the machine would be running a simulation on its rotating drums of lots of Enigma machines, taking them through all their possibilities. When they found a possibility that matched what an Enigma machine could do and matched the menu, that was known as a stop. When they had the stop, they had a guess at what the key settings might be. They could then try setting up an Enigma machine with those settings, type in an encoded message, and if German came out, the job was done. They would pass that key on to the next stage at Bletchley Park, and then any messages which had been intercepted on that particular network for that particular day could then be decrypted, and then those decrypts went through for analysis by the intelligence community, who work out the significance of the message, and then the next stage of deciding how it was going to be passed to commanders in the field. And when it arrived, they were known as messages from Ultra, and that was all the military knew. There was this system called Ultra that could get them information.
There are lower levels of communications intelligence which are not called Ultra, but what distinguishes Ultra from everything else is that it is hard to get into and very vulnerable, in the sense that if the other side were to realize you're breaking into it, it's fairly likely that they could shut down your access.
One of the biggest leaks from Bletchley Park came from Winston Churchill himself, when he disclosed the existence of what he called a crime that has no name, and that was the mass murder of Jews. And he knew about it because he'd been handed Bletchley Park decrypts, yet the Germans listened to his speech and understood that as he knew it, the British must be able to read their signal.
Unfortunately, when Ultra first became public in Frederick Winterbotham's book, he included this crazy story that Winston Churchill deliberately allowed Coventry to be bombed in 1940 in order to conceal the existence of Ultra. Well, he didn't. The Allies create rules which essentially say, never risk the compromise of Ultra for a minor tactical advantage, and always provide the enemy with some plausible explanation. So in the Mediterranean, for example, if Ultra lets you know where an Italian convoy is, well, fly a reconnaissance aircraft over it, and then an hour later hammer it.
In 1942, the German Navy introduced a fourth rotor to their Enigma machine. Turing's bomb was initially unable to break its codes. Bletchley Park began searching for a new solution. But fortunately, design flaws and simple operational mistakes contributed to fresh Enigma breaks.
The machine is designed so that you can set the fourth rotor to a neutral position and still communicate with someone that only has a three-rotor machine. So there is some traffic that's sent on four-rotor machines, but only using three rotors, if you like. And that's a mistake by the Germans, because it allows Bletchley to understand the machine much more fully than they would have if they'd just gone straight to four-wheel operations.
The Enigma machine was a triumph and a tragedy for the Germans. It was a fantastic machine, but of course, precisely because it was so good, the Germans found it almost impossible to believe that it could be penetrated, and so huge confidence was placed in it.
If Enigma had been used correctly, if its rigorous user protocols had been adhered to, its codes would have been unbreakable. But Bletchley Park's ability to exploit every mistake and correlate vast quantities of data was reflected in its incredible rate of expansion.
For every person that's doing this in 1939, there are 51 people doing it in 1945. And by that point, it is the largest British intelligence agency by a factor of about 10.
When Bletchley starts to become an industry, some of the major problems are, how do we house people? How do we get them into work? And if the British had known what Bletchley was going to become, they wouldn't have put Bletchley in Bletchley.
When I first sort of heard of it, I thought it was going to be terribly exciting. And I really thought probably I was going to be dropped as a spy or something. So I caught the train, and then I was rushed into Hartford. That was the naval section, with about 20 of us in or something. Of course, it grew and grew, and I should think there were about 2,000 people there by the time I left at the end of the war. A message came to us to put into proper German, and then that came to the index and library. The index was rows of postcards with the name of the ship or place or person, and then all the references to it and the numbers of the signals that referred to it. A simple index as you'd have in a book or anything. But of course, because we had no computers or any electronic equipment really, I suppose, in those days, it took up 2 or 3 vast rooms full of drawers with these cards in. I mean, sometimes there was great excitement and messages would be sent from one hut to another to clarify things, or a message would come from another hut to look up something to see if they'd got it right, you know.
The task of intercepting German signals was assigned to the Wrens, the Women's Royal Naval Service. They went through rigorous training to learn how to transcribe German naval signals at speed before they were posted to listening stations, known as WWII stations.
Well, the sets we mostly used were called HROs, and there's a biggish dial in the middle, and you spent your 4 hours on watch, or 8 hours if we're short-handed, searching up and down this, and if you came on a signal, it might be a carrier wave before the actual speech or Morse or whatever came up, but you then stuck with that. I don't remember anyone ever saying the word enigma, but we used to get this reams of coded messages, and they used a phonetic alphabet which started Anton, Bertha, César, Dora, Emil, Fritz, Gustav, and so on. And we wrote down, you know, and the important thing was never to guess. You put down what you could hear on message pads, and then one of the standby wrens would take it out of the watchroom, where you had to have absolute quiet, and teleprinter it over to Bletchley Park. You know, we'd no idea what we were picking up, but we knew it was sort of life and death, and you must get it right.
Listening stations were also picking up much longer and more complex codes than those produced by Enigma. They used the Baudo teleprinter code, 5 noughts or crosses, that when printed on a strip of paper appeared as either a punched hole or solid. They were sent through machines called Geheimschreiber, secret writer. Extremely sophisticated technology with staggering numbers of possibilities and combinations for encoding teleprinter traffic over landline or radio. The best known was the Lorenz cipher machine. This new traffic was called Fish, after a decoded intercept revealed the Germans called their teleprinter transmissions sawfish. The first discovered link was called tunafish, or tunny. It was immediately apparent that tunny messages carried information of an extremely sensitive and valuable nature.
Totally different from the much more rhythmic dot dash of Morse code, which was easy for people to learn. Non-Morse transmissions are fast and all the same length, and it's just 2 tones. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that people could pick up by ear. They had to develop machinery that could pick up those sounds, which we would recognise today if you listen to a modem.
Operators would tune in their radios and connect a machine called an undulator, and that produced on a strip of paper a trace of the rising or falling tones of the signal. That was known as a slip. That was then given to a slip operator who sat at a machine called a perforator and would translate that into letters in what was known as the telegraph code and punch those on the perforator. So they essentially had to look at the rising waveform on those tapes, turn those in their mind into ones and zeros, and turn groups of 5 ones and zeros into the corresponding letter. And they just learnt those 32 codes and to recognize them.
First person who made a break on this new material that was being picked up was Colonel John Tiltman. Somebody made the mistake of sending a very long message, over 3,000 characters, twice with the same key, but with minor differences. He worked out by hand you could start to pull them apart because of the small differences. So he made a 3,000 character run of the key. And the next stage was working out how the machine looked, how it worked, based purely on that intercepted key run.
It was obvious to them that the keys were much longer than the keys on an Enigma machine, and therefore moving at an electromechanical speed, where you can perhaps do a few hundred things a second, wasn't going to be enough.
Bill Tutt, a young student and chemist, spent months poring over figures until he deduced that the machine had 12 wheels, creating a new cipher key, which was added to the plain text. From this, he ascertained its structure and produced a statistical method for cracking the cipher. This is one of, if not the, greatest achievement in cryptographic history. They could now begin cracking tunny codes by hand, but it was an extremely slow and impractical method. Alan Turing did devise another technique called Delta, but it was also a hand method reliant on repeats. Max Newman, a later addition to the team, was assigned his own section to research ways of mechanising this process with a group based in Hut 11.
The first way they came up with doing it was to use an electromechanical machine, which they called the Robinson, and later on they called it the Heath Robinson, from the Heath Robinson cartoons of improbable machinery. And when they got the Heath Robinsons built, they discovered the method worked, but it wasn't quite up to doing it in real time. But then Tommy Flowers, who was from the Post Office Research Department, said, well, we could do this using electronics. So Flowers and his boss Radley, while still working on the Robinson and improving it, set about designing and creating the first Colossus.
A genius realization, the very idea that this sort of thing is possible. The thinking machine.
The first Colossus was completed within a matter of months, and by the end of January 1944 was up and running at Bletchley Park. It was programmed through plug boards and switches to count, compare and calculate basic binary arithmetic and deliver results via an electric typewriter. It could read 5,000 characters a second, and by the end of World War II had decrypted tens of thousands of tunny messages. The only real difference between the Colossus and a modern computer was its lack of memory.
The code breakers at Bletchley Park would use the Colossus machines to analyse the tapes to try and determine what the key was. And so essentially the Colossus machine was doing a statistical analysis of the message against the things that the code breakers guessed or knew about it. Once they had a key, they would then go to a machine called the tunny machine that was essentially an electrical version of the Lorentz machine. They would set up the tunny machine with the key of the day and then feed in the paper tape with the encrypted German message. And if Colossus had led them to the right key, what would come out on the teleprinter of the tunny machine was correct German. And then that was the decrypted message, and that went through to the intelligence analysis stage at Bletchley Park.
The Colossus was a huge, loud, hot machine. The paper tape transport section was so big it was called the bedstead. It utilised thermionic valves so prone to breaking when it turned on that they simply left the Colossus running 24 hours a day. Responsibility for its maintenance was in the hands of Bletchley engineers, but the day-to-day programming and operation of all the Colossi was left to the Wrens, most of whom were young girls that, although aware of the importance of their task, had no clue just how significant the messages coming from tunny traffic were to the war effort. This was intelligence of a much higher grade than Enigma. It was so important that by the end of the war, there were 10 Colossi at Bletchley and an 11th under construction. Most of them were recruited straight from school. So I think now there's this kind of mythology around Bletchley that everyone was a boffin and at Oxbridge and brainy. Well, these girls were fresh from school. In fact, the youngest was 14, because of course school ended for many at 14 years of age. I think the Joint Intelligence Committee weren't worried about these workers cackling, because if you're a young girl of that generation, you've never left uniform. You go from your school uniform, and if you're then put into one of the military services, into a military uniform, you don't talk, you don't ask questions. You know, that whole kind of idea of inquiring and right to knowledge, that's very modern.
In terms of the volume of intelligence, Enigma far outweighed the intelligence produced by the FISH project. But in terms of strategic usefulness, the FISH intelligence was far more important. And this was because it linked commanders of the armed forces in Berlin or at Königsberg out to the army commanders in the field. High quality strategic information. For example, they could set up deception operations, then follow the decrypt to see whether that deception information was working or not.
Operation Fortitude was part of a deception strategy referred to as Operation Bodyguard. Fortitude was divided into two parts, north and south. They used fake tanks, landing craft, aircraft and double agents to mislead German high command, so they believed the Allies were planning to land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. But one of the most sophisticated aspects was the creation of an entire fake army using wireless signals to suggest General Patton would be leading the fake 1st United States Army Group to invade Calais.
The number one wire recorder is an early form of magnetic recording device which has got 5 miles of very thin steel wire onto which you can record a message. It was famously used as part of Operation Fortitude South. A Royal Signals section called No. 5 Wireless Group were employed to listen to a division communicating. They then wrote a script to tailor it so that it sounded like it was this 1st United States Army Group and Patton would be leading it. They then recorded it and started transmitting openly, and to ensure that it seemed realistic, they used something called a spoof box, which hid the fact that there were only 7 transmitters and actually made each one sound that it was like a multiple set, adding that little bit of extra confusion so that hopefully the Germans would overhear them and get the idea that the invasion was going to take place in Calais.
The final station I was at, much the most exciting operational one, was Abbott's Cliff between Dover and Folkestone, 22 miles from Cap Greenet, so got an enormous amount of activity. We'd got our bombers going out, their bombers coming in, our fighters intercepting. We had an anti-aircraft unit right beside the station. It was very noisy, and of course it was in range of the German coastal guns. One Wren was in this rather isolated wooden tower with the aerial, and they rang you from the watchroom if they needed a reading. So you were there by yourself, and you didn't have to wear uniform. You wore jerseys and bell-bottoms and duffel coats. And I came out at 8 o'clock one morning, and coming over the cliff was a bunch of staff officers and people, and Winston Churchill in the middle. And any time in the war I saw him, I thought, what on earth is he doing on the cliff here at 8 o'clock in the morning? And you were supposed to salute, but only if you were wearing a hat. And as I wasn't, the only thing I could think of was to sort of wave and say, good morning, everybody. And they all waved back and said, good morning. And I was very puzzled about this, but I fairly recently heard that at least 5 times Churchill went down to that bit of coast opposite Cap Greenet, meaning to be seen, because Operation Fortitude was to kid the Germans into thinking we were landing at Cap Greenet, whereas we were going to Normandy.
Ultra was crucial for planning D-Day and Operation Overlord, the Battle of Normandy, and for success in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Only once the invasion of Western Europe started did signals intelligence become less important than military capability. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany surrendered. And on the 6th of August, the United States detonated an atomic bomb over the Japanese city Hiroshima. Three days later, another over the city of Nagasaki. Imperial Japan formally surrendered on the 2nd of September 1945, bringing all hostilities to an end. Tens of millions of lives had been lost. Europe was devastated. Most of the colossi were dismantled, and some components went to Manchester University, along with Max Newman and Alan Turing, where their knowledge fed into the continued development of British computing. I think there's the tendency to see war as this sort of scorched earth that's left behind, but actually it galvanises a society to pool its talent and to work out how to get one step ahead of the enemy.
What was constructed at Bletchley Park was a future university, generating new ideas and showing how people at apparently opposite ends of the academic spectrum could actually work together.
World War II is absolutely crucial in terms of refining the central intelligence machinery. And ironically, this kind of evolves as an antidote to Churchill. He would seize on a single piece of intelligence and he'd use this to bash his generals over the head. An absolute intelligence enthusiast of a kind of bombastic and irrepressible kind. And one of the reasons that we see a central machinery grow up is partly to contain Churchill, who would come up with 14 mad schemes every day. And it's actually his deputy prime minister, as much as Churchill, who develops how material from Bletchley Park going to be used in an organised way to make better foreign policy. And Britain pretty much marches out of the Second World War into the Cold War without breaking step.
The first post-war challenge was the daunting task of reorganising Europe. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, the US, UK and Soviet Union discussed the reorganisation of Germany. Later, at the Potsdam Conference, the Allies negotiated the division of Germany into 4 occupied areas. In 1946, GC and CS moved operations to Eastcote. They were renamed the London Signals Intelligence Centre, and by '52, they were renamed again, this time Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ. And by '54, there was another move, to new sites at Ben Hall and Oakley in Cheltenham. This was now the centre of signals intelligence for Britain, and GCHQ's intelligence represented the majority of secret information throughout this period of hot peace, known as the Cold War. Alliances were quickly strengthened against a common threat.
Many an American soldier has brought back from Great Britain a better mutual understanding between our nation and theirs. But the most vital aspect of the two nations' cooperation is that it maintains an ever-vigilant defense of government by the vote of the people against the continuing threat of communist encroachment.
The people who run GC and CS, particularly Commander Edward Travis, talks to the chiefs of staff and the head of the Foreign Office and says, will you let me negotiate a continuation of our relations? And both of them say yes, and Attlee, who's now Prime Minister, also agrees. And the chiefs of staff and Harry Truman, who's now the president, agree essentially that cooperation with the British and signals intelligence is an essential national interest.
The British big advantage in the early Cold War, one that made them so attractive as a partner to Americans, was the British have a chain of overseas bases in the colonies and friendly states. So they can offer a kind of global coverage, and Americans don't have this real estate.
By 1944, East and West were clashing over the future of Europe. Soviet human intelligence had penetrated every Western country as early as the 1930s. This had been partially revealed through a counterintelligence project the British called Bride and Americans Venona. The purpose of the project was to decrypt messages from Soviet intelligence agencies, and over many years it uncovered a number of high-profile Soviet agents. The project helped reinforce the special relationship between Britain and America. On the 5th of March 1946, an agreement was officially enacted. That agreement laid down rules for long-term cooperation in signals intelligence between the UK and the US, later adding Australia, Canada and New Zealand. 5 countries known to this day as the Five Eyes.
The relationship developed, particularly with the United States, at a very personal level and was handed on from generation to generation, saying these are people you can work with, these are people you can trust. It goes much deeper than sharing of resources. It's a shared culture, the fact that behind the intelligence effort are shared values. And the principal adversary was international communism and Soviet communism.
There's a generation of people in the 1930s who are radicalized, who conclude that capitalism has failed, communism is the wave of the future, and fascism is a danger that must be crushed.
Human intelligence sources behind the Iron Curtain were few and far between. For the Soviets, human intelligence sources in the West were significant.
Around 1947-48, traders within British and American intelligence compromised the 2 biggest SIGINT successes of this period. Kim Philby, who is serving in Washington at this time, is able to find out about Venona and warns the Russians. On top of that, the American Army Security Agency hires a person to work with its operations named Weisband, who in fact is a Comintern agent. And Weisband soon discovers the Anglo-American success in breaking into Soviet machine ciphers. So between Philby and Weisband, essentially, in 1948, the Soviets are able to shut down any further access.
This is a story of the Berlin airlift, the operation carried out by the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force to supply 2.25 million people of Berlin with food, coal, and other necessities of life.
The first major crisis of the Cold War started on the 4th of June 1948, when, in reaction to the Deutschmark being introduced in West Berlin, the Soviet Union blocked all rail, road and canal routes into the Allied control zones. They agreed to lift the blockade if the Deutschmark was removed. After nearly a year of dropping thousands of tons of necessities every day into West Germany, the Soviet Union realized their blockade was failing and removed it.
The Berlin blockade marks a period when the British and Americans lost access to a lot of Soviet material, a lot of Soviet traffic, because the Russians just used more landlines, a lot more high-strength ciphers on the communications, effectively shut the Western powers out. The GCHQ and the NSA eventually had to spend a long time trying to find ways to gather information from Soviets. The Berlin blockade confirms that the Cold War has started. There's been issues before that over Iran, over the Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine, and Soviet intensification of control, the Sovietization of Eastern Europe. But really it comes to a head to the Berlin blockade.
The Berlin blockade is the first moment when leaders think war might be only weeks away. War is now potentially so damaging, so catastrophic. It's at this moment that one of the values of GCHQ becomes apparent.
The role of GCHQ in terms of high policy would have been to ensure that the Cold War did not become a hot war, and a hot war meant fighting a nuclear war with the Soviet Union.
Because war warning is so critical for GCHQ, in this early Cold War period, what you see are lots and lots of units spread out across places like Germany who are just listening into the Eastern Bloc. We can't decrypt a lot of Russian communications. That doesn't really matter. What you're listening to is the background noise. The bear is in the forest. It makes certain routine noises every week, every month. If those noises change, the bear is potentially going to do something different.
In an effort to glean better intelligence from operations in Berlin, the SIS and CIA joined forces in the mid-50s for Operation Gold. They dug a tunnel nearly half a mile long under the world's most patrolled border to tap into telephone cables. 2 years of sustained access, recording and transcribing hundreds of thousands of conversations, identifying numerous KGB and GRU agents followed. But in 1956, they were shut down by the Soviets, who'd been receiving intelligence from George Blake, an SIS operative and double agent. He was caught, tried and sentenced to 42 years, but escaped to Russia, where he settled in Moscow on a KGB pension. But Cold War hostilities weren't restricted to the Soviet Union.
GCHQ and the NSA had very specific duties to help the West in their kind of proxy wars with communism throughout the world.
Smaller countries in the Third World, they were much easier for Western powers to target, because often these countries had less advanced cipher machine technology, and they just weren't aware of the breakthroughs against Enigma during World War II, because the British Americans kept that secret deliberately to avoid countries becoming aware of that and taking countermeasures.
Korea was the first major conflict between the opposing ideologies of East and West, but it wasn't the last. America would end up in Vietnam, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and Britain in the Suez region.
For Britain, in the 1950s, the Soviets were seen as the main threat, and communism was seen as the main threat. And a lot of GCHQ's efforts went to try and track Soviet missile program, bomber program, and nuclear program, because there's the existential threat to Britain. But also British interests were threatened globally by countries that weren't communist, but they were left-wing nationalists, like Nasser in Egypt, for example, because he was obviously such a threat to their interest in the Middle East.
The British and the French launched Operation Musketeer when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced he was going to nationalise the Suez Canal in 1956. They used an Israeli invasion of the Sinai Desert as a pretext to invade the region and take control of the canal zone under the guise of a peacekeeping force.
The British had broken Egyptian communications at that point. They could read Egyptian diplomatic ciphers, probably some military ones as well. And they'd done it through planting bugs in the Egyptian embassy in London. But that wasn't enough for Britain to achieve its objectives, though. And the British seemed to have panicked to some extent. They did seem to fear the Russians might be coming in terms of maybe Russian volunteers flying planes into Syria and then taking part. Because they'd seen that happen in Korea only a few years earlier on. It was a real fear of communist volunteers coming over.
Although a military success, global reaction to the operation was overwhelmingly negative and led to tension in the special relationship. Musketeer was a political disaster. With the British cabinet divided, Prime Minister Anthony Eden called a ceasefire. Underground warfare continued between Britain and Egypt for influence in the region throughout the 50s and 60s, erupting in open conflict in Aden, South Yemen. This complex two-part civil war did enormous damage and perhaps helps to explain Yemen's impoverished state today. In the late 1950s, British intelligence seems to have averted an attempted coup in Jordan and another in Kuwait. Meanwhile, the British Empire was contracting rapidly. At one time, there'd been numerous GCHQ listening stations all over the Middle East, but a coup in Iraq forced GCHQ to abandon operations in Baghdad, and as Britain shed its colonies, they fell back to the Mediterranean island of Cyprus, a key listening station and centre for broadcasting propaganda throughout the Middle East.
Cyprus, as it turns out, technically speaking, is better situated than anything else you've got.
As decolonisation starts to happen, the British want to try and find a way to keep access to these territories. Of course, Cyprus is the jewel in the crown of Britain's SIGINT empire by the 60s. It's lucky, it's right on the doorstep of the Middle East, the most volatile region in the world, so the British are lucky to have this real estate there they can use.
In 1957, Russia launched its first satellite, Sputnik 1. This ushered in a new era. In 1962, fighting broke out between Indonesia and the Federation of Malaysia. It began with an attempted coup against the independent pro-British state, Sultan of Brunei. This was authorised by President Sukarno of Indonesia. GCHQ became an integral part of Operation Claret, working with special forces, feeding real-time intelligence for cross-border operations on the island of Borneo against Sukarno's forces. It was uncharted territory for Britain's intelligence services.
This is path-breaking because this is a new method of war integrating high-level signals intelligence and commandos. And arguably GCHQ and the Special Air Service pioneered this in the 1950s and the 1960s.
The British, in theory, could have, say, destroyed the Indonesian Air Force. But if they did that, the question would be what would happen next? Would Russian volunteers turn up, Russian aircraft turn up? Would they be condemned at the UN? So the British was always scarred by the lesson of Suez, and the British tried to keep the confrontation a secret war to a large extent. The British had also broken the Indonesian military and diplomatic ciphers, and I would argue perhaps the confrontation with Indonesia is GCHQ's biggest success that we know about in the mid-Cold War period.
Indonesia was the birthplace of the Special Forces SIGINT partnership that helped defeat President Sukarno's forces by 1966. Work to build the Berlin Wall began in 1961, a physical manifestation of the ideological division between East and West.
Finally, in August 1961, the communists built their wall of shame. It was an act of brutal desperation, unparalleled in modern history.
As the arms race continued throughout the 60s, signals intelligence played a key role in securing treaties. GCHQ had become the largest intelligence gathering organisation in the UK, but had still remained a complete secret. Its time in the shadows was coming to an end. In 1976, a series of articles by journalist Duncan Campbell were published, and for the first time the acronym GCHQ was printed.
Up until that point, GCHQ had been virtually unknown. Even the achievements in World War II had been virtually unknown, and the British were very reluctant to release this information. Countries in the developing world, they weren't aware of what people could do, and so they were very poor at cipher security, about security in offices.
The fact that people like Duncan Campbell were put on trial for even discussing this in public was a watershed in the way in which government and the public discuss these things. It's no coincidence that in the 1980s, this is the moment when Bletchley Park's archives are opened up and Britain publishes an important official history of intelligence in the Second World War. The British government is beginning to realise that it needs to explain the nature of these organisations.
One of GCHQ's most formidable targets throughout this era was on its doorstep, in Northern Ireland. An intelligence battleground that lasted until the Good Friday Agreement in 1998.
GCHQ was increasingly involved in Northern Ireland to try and find out what networks were being established, how they communicated with each other, and disrupt them.
The IRA's concept was that they lived in a prison, and every phone call, every movement was potentially something that gave them away. So we know as early as the 1970s, the IRA was developing its own Bletchley Park, its own signals intelligence capacity, taking apart radios, transistors and valves from televisions and building its own monitoring equipment.
The conflict in Northern Ireland in the 1990s reached a very important turning point. Digital technology was starting to roll out across the UK and in society in Northern Ireland. We saw GCHQ, MI5, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the British Army were starting to look at how they could monitor those communications channels that the British public and particularly the population of Northern Ireland was starting to use. And we saw the first surveillance of mobile phone traffic, the first attempt to use number plate recognition technology, the first use of CCTV, and we saw the first attempt to try and pull all those technologies together to monitor the IRA activity within Northern Ireland and try and find those needles in a haystack in a way that had never been tried before. You are at the foothills of where we are today.
Direction-finding aerials enable the Army to pinpoint walkie-talkie communications, even the activation of radio bombs. There's remote-controlled closed-circuit television. There's Clarabelle, the anti-sniper device, apparently more effective on static locations than on Land Rovers. Then there are infrared floodlights that illuminate Crossmaglen Square at night.
The IRA stepped up their campaign of bombing in the UK throughout the 90s, including the London Stock Exchange and the Baltic Exchange, the largest detonation on British soil since World War II.
I think the resolution of the Irish problem did come because Ted Heath in particular turned it into an intelligence war. Things like the Good Friday Agreement came about because the IRA understood they could not win the security war.
In 1982, GCHQ's intelligence played a key role in the Falklands War. In 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew the last of its troops from Afghanistan, ending a decade of conflict against the Mujahideen. On November the 9th that same year, the Berlin Wall came down. A dire economic situation saw the Soviet Union move in a radically different direction under Mikhail Gorbachev. Events moved at extraordinary speed. The Iron Curtain crashed down, and the Cold War came to an end in 1991. That same year, the combat phase of the first Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, began.
This was a territorial dispute that had lasted for decades. Iraq's threat against Kuwait had been there for decades. And actually the intelligence services picked up the Iraqi forces moving to the Kuwait border. So this is an example of a warning, but the leaders just weren't paying attention.
GCHQ played a crucial part in seeking a resolution to the complex range of wars in former Yugoslavia. During the Dayton Accord, GCHQ's efforts informed experienced users of signals intelligence who had a day-to-day impact on negotiations. The royal family and the intelligence services hit the headlines throughout this period, including accusations that GCHQ had bugged the royals' private telephone calls in order to protect them from the IRA. The accusations denied by GCHQ to this day. Then, in 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was killed when her car crashed in Paris.
Diana was in a motor car with her companion of recent days, Dodi Fayed. The motor car was in a motor accident. It's believed they may have been trying to escape the attention of paparazzi who were pursuing them, as it were, on motorcycles. The Mercedes car in which they were travelling overturned, we understand.
Among the conspiracy theories which became associated with poor Diana's death was the idea that somehow GCHQ had been monitoring Princess Di and providing this material to the British government or to Prince Charles. And the most important and interesting thing is that when you had the final coroner's investigation, something absolutely unique happened. The government produced as a witness John Eadie, who had been director of GCHQ in the late 1980s and early 1990s, testifying in public, the first time it ever happened. He was asked by the coroner, did you monitor Princess Di's communication? And John Eadie did something which is absolutely contrary to GCHQ policy at the time, which at that time would always be, I can neither confirm nor deny. What John Eadie said was, I can categorically assure you that GCHQ never monitored communications of Princess Di. And of course, he's on oath, but I believe he's also telling the truth. And this is actually the first time that GCHQ ever went on public record as saying, no, we did not do something.
Throughout the 90s, there was a major shift in the focus for the intelligence community as it entered a globalised digital era. Parliament legislated to place Britain's security and intelligence services on a statutory footing for the first time. This had three purposes: national security, detection and prevention of serious crime, and protection of the economic well-being of the nation from external threats. By the late 90s, public internet traffic was growing by around 100% a year. The number of mobile phones in the world was over 700 million. Global telephone traffic was in excess of 100 billion minutes a year. In the summer of 1998, Francis Richards became GCHQ's director and joined the chief of SIS and the Director General of MI5 at Downing Street to discuss the threats now facing Britain, including terrorism and organised crime.
Tony Blair has an organised crime summit at 10 Downing Street almost as soon as he comes into power. And this signals that he's asking the intelligence services, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, to give more attention to the threat of organised crime. By the 1990s, we're in a globalised world. and these boundaries between domestic and foreign make less and less sense, really. Lots of states, not least Britain, embrace globalization as a source of new wealth. There's astronomical increases in the volumes of trade, but porous borders that allow money, ideas, people to flow across them are also the sorts of borders that are liked by organized criminals and terrorists. We're seeing the rise of a new kind of terrorism, which is much more complicated and which is piggybacking on this globalized communications revolution. Often religiously inspired, strange Japanese Buddhists, extreme Jewish terrorists assassinate their own prime minister. We have radical Christian terrorism with people like Timothy McVeigh. We have the rise of Islamic terrorism. As Britain benefits from globalization, the intelligence services have to deal with all the messy stuff. So we see people like Tony Blair turning to the intelligence services to deal with the underside of globalization.
In 1992, Al-Qaeda detonated 2 bombs in Aden, Yemen, in an attempt to kill American soldiers en route to Somalia. In 1993, an Islamist terrorist cell detonated a truck bomb inside the North Tower of New York's World Trade Center. In 1998, Al-Qaeda simultaneously detonated bombs at US embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya, killing over 200, including 12 US citizens. In 2000, Al-Qaeda militants launched a suicide attack on the missile destroyer USS Cole, killing 17. Then, on the 11th of September 2001, just before 3 p.m., 2 aircraft, laden with passengers and fuel, flew into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. That day, Al-Qaeda succeeded in coordinating 4 separate terrorist attacks in the US, killing and injuring thousands. The prime suspect was Osama bin Laden.
One of the core conceptual problems in intelligence is that an absence of evidence about something is not necessarily evidence of absence of something. In terms of 9/11, one of many desperate failings of intelligence was that they did not spot the Islamist network, the Islamist conspiracy to try to bring terror to the United States of America. We often don't spend enough time thinking about it. It was the second attack on the World Trade Center. They were not seen as being in any way connected with each other. You had a network of people who adopted an interpretation of the peaceful religion of Islam that was used to justify terrible acts of violence, to try to use the concept of the national security state against itself, to show that governments could not deliver security from what purported to be a small group of committed terrorists.
The US announced Operation Enduring Freedom, the war on terror. And since Al-Qaeda's leader Osama bin Laden was hiding in Afghanistan, US President George W. Bush demanded the Taliban hand him over and expel Al-Qaeda from the country. When they refused, the United States and its allies, including Great Britain, invaded.
In 2002, 2003, there was a lot of quite vexed negotiation going around the United Nations. People were trying to get a second resolution for the war against Iraq, and a lot of pressure was building up on the non-permanent members of the Security Council, countries like Mexico, for example. And at this point, there's a message from NSA to GCHQ saying we need to gather more intelligence on these middle powers and find ways to essentially push them in our direction. And people at GCHQ were becoming uncomfortable about seeming to manipulate a process of world democracies.
So outraged by the request, GCHQ translator Catherine Gunn leaked the email. On the 2nd of March, it made front-page news.
Catherine Gunn's actions almost certainly surprised GCHQ because it's had a very good security record. It's had very few moles, whistleblowers, leakers, defectors, while its American partner has had really quite a lot. But of course, the Catherine Gunn episode tells us a lot about the way in which GCHQ is remaking itself. GCHQ has become a more public organisation, there's more oversight, and so there's an incredible obsession with lawfulness. So when workers in GCHQ began to worry about the approach of the Iraq War, they were all sent an email by the managers at GCHQ that reassured them that they would do nothing unlawful. And this shows you how important law has become in the 21st century. And so later on, when Catherine Gunn was taken to court, the first thing her defence team asked to see was the full legal judgment around the British decision for war. And this was pretty much the last document which the British government wished to reveal to the public. So overnight, the Catherine Gunn case collapsed. But this just highlights how critical lawfulness and regulation has become for organisations like GCHQ in the 21st century.
The leak was unprecedented, but it wasn't the only source of controversy surrounding the plan to invade Iraq.
Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
The role of British intelligence agencies and their political masters in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War is a real sort of interesting case study in how parts of the intelligence community had not caught up with the technological transformations that had been taking place in intelligence gathering. A group of mandarins based in Whitehall called the Joint Intelligence Committee, building up assessments that were going to be presented to the highest level of government, saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. The information it was receiving was human in from agents. It was trying to interpret photographs of factories or missile bases or nuclear processing plants, which in many ways was little different from what they'd done in World War II. They had the weapons inspectors from the UN who were feeding in their information. They had defector reports, they had overhead surveillance, but it wasn't connected to the rest of the world by the internet. So you had that disconnect between the previous era of intelligence gathering and the future era of intelligence gathering. The analysis bit in the middle, it was processing in a way that wasn't very much different from classic days of the Cold War and World War II. And yes, there's been all this stuff about political interference, but you have to wonder whether it was more to do with they were never going to get on top of this subject because they just didn't have the tools to do it. Blair and Bush and all these people said they weren't declaring stuff to the UN, they were not letting the inspectors in, so therefore they must be hiding something. But really they were doing that to try and pretend they had it to scare off the Israelis and the Iranians and make the Iraqi people think they still had poison gas so they couldn't revolt. They couldn't think like a mad dictator.
One of the challenges for all the signals intelligence services in places like Afghanistan and Iraq was that really most of their opponents were using non-traditional off-the-shelf mobile phones, off-the-shelf radios. So a lot of the equipment that the British and the Americans had developed for signals intelligence was effectively military. This was a very rapid learning environment and a lot of improvisation. So GCHQ workers are having to develop new forms of technology and they're working with unexpected partners.
Iraq had an analog copper wire telecommunications infrastructure. The US invasion shatters all that. In the space of a matter of months, the population of Iraq have to rebuild their telephone infrastructure and they go to a digital mobile phone network and the associated internet network that goes with that. And it was an American company that installed these systems. So they were able to hardwire in the surveillance infrastructure to allow them to harvest information on an industrial scale. This, over the next 2 years, allowed the US Special Forces, Joint Special Operations Command, Delta Force, US Navy SEALs, British SAS, to create a system of intelligence gathering to home in on key targets in the insurgency. For the first time, you had a generation of intelligence gathering professionals, special forces operatives, who were able to penetrate communications in a way that had never been seen since Ultra in World War II, capturing the insurgents' mobile phones and computers. They would take them back to the main bases, and the NSA GCHQ guys would download the call logs, the email traffic, and within minutes geolocating the positions of the people who the captured terrorists had been phoning. They would then task the SAS guys, the Delta Force guys, to try and capture the guy before he has time to throw his phone away and run down the street. So it became as dynamic as that. And once they caught, him, they'd do the same thing with his phone and try and roll up the whole network and just keep it going. In World War II, Ultra allowed the Allies to read German communications in a matter of days. In Iraq, they were measuring it in minutes, which is a revolution in intelligence gathering.
By the end of 2003, GCHQ had begun the move to the new headquarters in Cheltenham. But even after the 9/11 attacks, Islamist terrorism was still not regarded as a serious threat in Britain. That was about to change. An Al-Qaeda-linked group claimed responsibility for the 7/7 attacks in London. But an inquiry eventually concluded that the bombers were British-born, cleanskins, previously unknown to the intelligence community. 2 weeks later, another 4 bombs failed to fully detonate on public transport in London. Islamist terrorism had become a genuine threat on British soil.
In the early noughties, MI5 undoubtedly went to interview people like Abu Hamza and Abu Qatada. And they told MI5 that, rest assured, there were no intentions to carry out terrorist attacks in the United Kingdom. And MI5 believed them. And then the first Islamist plot against the United Kingdom was hatched in 1999 by a chemistry teacher in Birmingham called Moin al-Abidin. That was clear evidence of Islamist terrorist bomb-making activity, but our security community saw it as a one-off incident. By looking at what MI5, counter-terrorist police, had failed to do when it came to the communications of the London bombers that they had intercepted, those failures were a failure to understand that people regarded as being on the periphery of a plot might be central to further plots, that it was a network, that people who knew each other, and they knew each other for a purpose. And the purpose was not because they prayed together, it was a group of people acting together because they wanted to blow us up.
The 7/7 attacks come a year after terrible attacks in Madrid, and the sense of impending threat is very significant. Really, this drives a step change in the amount of resource that's being directed towards intelligence.
Terrorism is one of those issues that attracts a huge amount of intelligence which governments and intelligence agencies have to deal with. And if they don't do it, then of course the issue is maybe there's another 7/7. As we found out dealing with the IRA, the best you can really hope for against a terrorist organization is for it to simply die away or cut a deal. My own pessimistic assessment of what has happened in the past 18 years is that we have not found a way to make terrorism go away.
There's no doubt that GCHQ and MI5 and MI6 foiled a number of important plots and were accessing some really important intelligence. But what we see over that decade is the terrorists learning. We're seeing smaller and smaller groups. We're seeing groups that don't travel abroad to train, that are becoming increasingly allergic to electronic communication. Around the time of 9/11, even around the time of the 7/7 bombings, there was lots of stuff to listen into, but as time has gone on, that chatter has diminished.
The reason for the development of the techniques of mass data mining and ability not to surveil everybody, but to surveil anybody who might be participating in an Islamist network, that has meant that plots become relatively easier to disrupt, and that we're seeing individuals with trucks and kitchen knives rather than bombs. That's been thanks to the interception of communications of these people.
We have in the decade following 9/11 is some very major debates around electronic gathering. Do you focus in on particular targets? Do you collect needles in haystacks, or do you collect the entire haystack? And by 2008, the British government is already beginning to realise that its legislation for governing the interception of data is about 20 or 30 years out of date. And so we see the Home Secretary, Jackie Smith, bringing in legislation to try and modernise this, but also to try and pass some of the burden of intelligence gathering away from the state to the large corporations. And intriguingly, the large corporations rebel. Not only do they want to avoid carrying the cost of doing data preservation for the intelligence services, they're also a little bit anxious about how are some of their big business customers going to react to this.
In 2009, a document between the director in charge of GCHQ's Mastering the Internet project and a senior member of the agency's cyber defence team was leaked to the British press. It quoted concerns over the ability to maintain a leading position in monitoring and safeguarding cyber intelligence in such a rapidly evolving technological climate. And then, Snowden.
NSA and GCHQ were running 3 critical programs that were exposed by Snowden. One was a telephone data collection system. Another was called PRISM. People would be using email, they'd be using Facebook, they'd be using WhatsApp. They were assuming these things were encrypted, but GCHQ and NSA were accessing the internet at the points before it was encrypted. PRISM was providing GCHQ and NSA with probably about half its intelligence. And finally, there was X-Keyscore. It was almost like taking your fingerprint. Even if you move to a different computer terminal, start using a different logon, start using a different email, the profile of your activities, what you're searching for, what you're looking at, will quickly identify you. So these were 3 really critical programs that were providing a very large proportion of GCHQ's intelligence. They were all exposed by Snowden.
It's, I think, very evident that the large number of attacks that have been stopped so far in the UK, much of that has come from the ability to ask intelligent questions of big data. The ethical issue is how long should intelligence agencies, or indeed the companies, be required to keep the data. But in a sense, by taking a large amount of data, what's called bulk access, say communication data of who called whom, when, how, and where, not the content of the communication, that data about the communication. By taking that, having it stored and available means that after there's a terrorist attack and you know what questions to ask of the data's there. Most of the data in such a big data set is of no interest to the intelligence agency, but you can't find the needle in the haystack if you haven't got a haystack to start with.
In the old days of radio, communications were either internal or external. Any communication in Britain, GCHQ couldn't touch, unless there was a specific warrant. Anything outside Britain was fair game. Now, when we get to the internet age, given the way it functions, internal and external divisions no longer work. If I send an email to you across the room, it might go through Moscow. Traffic from 2 people in Moscow might pass through Britain. And what that means is that if you want to intercept foreign traffic, you have to intercept traffic within your own country. So the question is this legal or not? And by the way, if you're intercepting traffic outside your country, you're still intercepting communications of your own citizens. So how do you deal with it? Well, the approach the Five Eyes came up with was essentially this. We're going to anonymize it, turn it into metadata, strip away most of the individual characteristics. And we will then use very sophisticated systems to try to look for connections between people. But if we find an IP address that's within our country, we discard it. Unless we have reason to believe that there's a connection to a threat, in which case we then have to turn toward a legal approach. If you're looking for the people who make aggressive use of data, it ain't GCHQ and NSA. It's Facebook, it's Google. And personally, I have far more concerns about data miners than I do about national agencies, which are bound by law.
I think the public is becoming more aware of the business model of the internet, which is to take your data and monetize it. In return, you get the value of the service. People have been very happy so far to take the convenience of instant communication with their friends or the ability to buy whatever you want very quickly on Amazon. That's the benefit. The downside is you have to give information to get that service. That trade-off is being increasingly questioned. I think we should guard our personal data and consent when we give it to someone else. The problem with national intelligence is you can't have individuals consenting to their information being used in some hunt, for example, for terrorist suspects. So it's a decision that has to be taken at a national level. We're a democracy, so it's Parliament that has to take that decision. And that's what happened at the end of 2016 when Parliament passed the massive Investigatory Powers Act.
Amongst many provisions in the Investigatory Powers Bill, it gave a long list of organisations the authority to access internet connection records. It forces internet service providers to retain a record of the websites we visit for up to a year and to decrypt any data requested. It gives security services the power to hack any device as part of an investigation. And in April 2018, the UK High Court ruled it violates EU law. But as we discovered in 2014, these capabilities are of little use if the target goes offline.
In the build-up to the Crimea crisis, the Russians were able to organise their forces and launch them on their operation without Western intelligence knowing what was happening. They went to extreme lengths to only use verbal communications, and once the operation was underway, there was no radio traffic, there was no internet communications, and the Russians created total surprise. In 2015, again, the Russians and the Iranians and the Syrians organised their attack verbally. Then they set in train the deployment of the Russian forces in a way that totally confused the West. That ability shows a real understanding of Western intelligence surveillance.
Intervening in Syria is one way in which Putin has forced the West to recognize that Russia is somebody you have to talk to.
The last decade has seen really an entire new vista of activity for organisations like GCHQ and NSA. We're now into an era in which computers are being weaponised, and perhaps the most visible example of this was the efforts against Iranian centrifuges in 2008, 2009. This was a remarkable episode because what you can see here is an attack on a target which is not connected to the internet. It's quite a secure target. So to attack those Iranian centrifuges, the so-called Stuxnet attack, there had to be a reconnaissance, and then a warhead had to be sent in to disrupt those centrifuges. And of course, since then, we've seen the Russians almost certainly take down Ukrainian nuclear power stations. And the looming question, I think, for all European leaders is, could the Russians turn off all the power stations in Europe on the coldest day of the year? And the answer is undoubtedly yes, they could.
There have been a couple of incidents where momentarily the internet was closed down in Syria, which is suspected of being a US cyber attack, which was perceived to be a demonstration of capability. On the one hand, that's a threat, but also it's a deterrent, because the Russians probably have the same capability, so they are being deterred from doing it because they might be just as vulnerable as the West is, and the internet has become something that you can't afford to lose. The UK government has owned up to having cyber weapons, and it says that rests within GCHQ. And the government say that they have carried out offensive cyber operations against Islamic State. They've talked about doing denial of service, planting malware in their operatives' computers, or trying to close down their access onto the internet. UK government, it makes it very clear that their use of these weapons would be governed by the laws of war. The UK, by implication, is disavowing any kind of attack on the communications systems of a target nation's hospitals, or switching off railway signals so trains crash. That kind of thing is deemed to be beyond the pale.
The new era of cyber war presents GCHQ and the Cabinet Office and also the National Cyber Security Centre with a whole range of very difficult challenges, because the question they have to answer is, which bits of our national infrastructure do we want to defend? The rail network, railway points, these are things which were never really intended to be connected to the internet, and they've actually been connected through quite insecure systems. Essentially, GCHQ is being confronted with the problem of defending everything in Britain against everything in the world.
It's almost back to the first stages of nuclear deterrence in the 1950s, where the Americans had the bomb, the Russians got it, then the Chinese got it, then the Britain and the French got it. It set up a sort of a system of mutual assured destruction. We are maybe heading towards that sort of situation with cyber warfare, and that kind of deterrence theory is being played out between the main powers of the world. The argument comes, though, is can someone do it from their bedroom on a laptop? Terrorist groups, or even just disgruntled teenagers. This is a new battleground in multi-dimensions, and we are not quite sure where it's going to play out.
It's already the case that in battlefield conditions, before the kinetic battle starts, a cyber battle has already taken place.
The future of international conflict is going online. An adversary might simply tweak the UK economy with a computer virus, cut a few fibre optic cables, slow things down, coerce voting patterns, bring a country to its knees without firing a single shot.
Mark Zuckerberg understood that people weren't paying for something, they were actually the goods that were being produced. And the amount of information people put on Facebook that could be used by hostile states or hostile individuals was massive. And if you're prepared to sell it,
getting information about individual likes and dislikes is so valuable. If you can use these techniques to influence somebody's choice of a holiday, you can use them to influence somebody's choice of political party. And at that point, you have to really think hard about, is this manipulation simply coming from within our own political system, or is somebody outside trying to interfere with it? That must be unacceptable. That's the death of democracy.
The National Cybersecurity Center, which is part of GCHQ, is set up essentially to be a defensive system for the entire British population against any cyber criminals of foreign organizations. It's a public organization which has part of itself buried in the secret organization of GCHQ. Because if you consider foreign terrorists, foreign criminals, foreign states trying to interfere with your society, well, in a way, they're all different variations of the same theme. So protecting your society from foreign entities, I think, will become GCHQ's main function.
GCHQ's role is growing more complex and divisive as developments in technology and the availability of knowledge have democratized the world of encryption and code breaking, making it harder for them to stay one step ahead of the threat. But we can be sure of one thing: there will be threats, and balancing security with privacy will be one of the greatest challenges GCHQ faces in the coming age of cyber insecurity.
We are constantly on the alert in this country and all Western countries for any signs that some kind of organized cyber attack on us might be taking place. During the Cold War, we worried about any unusual military activity. Today, we're interested in cyber incursions, and our response has to be to put more and more resources into this. We have to understand that the first skirmishes and possibly the future war itself will not be fought with conventional weapons, but in cyberspace, and therefore we have to arm ourselves with the cyber tools and the skills of individuals to make sure that the other side cannot win. The Cold War was an intelligence war, it was a national security issue, where the units were intercontinental ballistic missiles. And as we move into the 21st century, there the units are units of information.
The key for the intelligence agencies is to have societal surveillance to allow them, once they've identified a target, to instantly generate their digital footprint. But there's so much rapid deployment of new social media platforms that understanding how these applications are working is a fundamental part of the intelligence battle.
The possession of data is in itself now a descriptor of a superpower, and how that data is manipulated and exploited will be a prime tool in the wars that are to come, which may not be fought for obvious reasons with intercontinental ballistic missiles. Data wars have made future wars look profitable again. That should be a cause of great concern to us. And the frontline troops of the new cyber warfare that is unfolding before our eyes, not the military, GCHQ and NSA, they are going to be in the front line, and it may be the only line.